We live these days in a valley of many shadows. I don't know how it compares to other eras, but I think when our Senator John McCain writes an op-ed in the New York Times in defense of human rights, friends, it's time to pay attention. I joke because it seems Senator McCain isn't often in agreement with UU ideals, but this week's editorial was really fine in places, I thought. In talking about international relations and maintaining our insistence on human rights in times of conflict, he wrote, "Depriving the oppressed of a beacon of hope could lose us the world we have built and thrived in. It could cost our reputation in history as the nation distinct from all others in our achievements, our identity, and our enduring influence on mankind." His word. "Our values are central to all three," end quote. Senator McCain was talking about international relations, but there are many Americans for whom a beacon of hope is being actively snuffed in this political moment. Undocumented immigrants, people of color, and one group which intersects all the others, women. The recent threats to women are ominous. Pregnancy a pre-existing condition? Medicaid cuts which disproportionately affect women. Funding for Planned Parenthood is under threat, which, as you probably know, imperils not just abortion funding, but cancer screening and treatment and lots of other basic health care needs. The fight for equal pay for women has been set back at least a decade and perhaps a generation. Funding has been slashed for initiatives that have helped educate girls and women nationwide, one of the surest ways to move a nation out of poverty. This Mother's Day, it is clear that women and girls are in the crosshairs of right-wing idealists and national leadership. This is not normal. It is not just another swing of the political pendulum. It is intentionally regressive, and it is counter long-held Unitarian Universalist values. It becomes important to look to the past, to remind ourselves just how abnormal this is. Important today to remind ourselves that 250 years ago, some of the notions which are now under threat were already being debated. I have a practice of preaching on Mother's Day about an influential Unitarian woman, someone who's championed the rights of women and often of oppressed people in general, and who helped bend the moral arc of the universe, as Theodore Parker said, toward justice. The subject of this year's Mother's Day sermon, Mary Wollstonecraft, attended the Unitarian chapel at Newington Green from 1782 to 1785 and had lifelong Unitarian friends, which has led to her inclusion on every list of famous Unitarians I have ever seen. Unitarians Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton dedicated their 1881 book, A History of Women's Suffrage, to Wollstonecraft. It is my honor to reflect on her thinking as an inspiration for our own action, perhaps to redefine again, as we seem to need to do every generation at least, what it can mean to be a woman and a mother. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in 1759. Her abusive father tried his hand at a series of ventures which eventually left the family in a precarious financial position. As money dwindled, most of the resources went to Mary's older brother, a fact which, of course, she resented. Becoming an author in the 18th century was tremendously difficult for women, as you might imagine. She hid her chosen profession as long as she could from her family because she knew they would disapprove. But finally, when she could keep it from them no longer, she wrote to her sister, "I am then going to be the first of a new genus. I tremble at the attempt. My undertaking would subject me to ridicule and an inundation of friendly advice to which I cannot listen. I must be independent. This project has long floated in my mind." And she concluded, "You know I was not born to tread in the beaten track. The peculiar bent of my nature pushes me on." Mary was right to be cautious. Because she had no money to buy new clothes and did not coif and powder her hair in the style of the day, because she did not value many of the social get-togethers which her peers attended, some called her a, quote, philosophical sloven, unquote. The implication was that she was unkempt and unclean, though she journals about the benefits of bathing regularly in a time when bathing was an occasional event at best, when fleas bit even the wealthiest and vermin were known to nest in their fancy hairdos. I think what philosophical sloven, what that insult really meant was that she made men nervous. And I think that was just fine with Mary Wollstonecraft. She had some success at writing and editing children's books, at writing book reviews, and at translation. All those were sort of culturally acceptable pursuits for an 18th century woman. But in 1790, the year after the French Revolution began, she crossed the line of what was socially acceptable. The basic thrust of the revolution was the overthrow of the French monarchy, the establishment of a democratic form of government. Wollstonecraft traveled to France to be part of the revolution, and as she recorded in her journal, watched out her hotel window as King Louis was transported by chariot to his death. Leading figures in the French Revolution wrote a pamphlet called The Rights of Man. It was influenced by Thomas Jefferson and functioned as sort of a declaration of the universal human rights for which the revolutionaries were fighting, including, quote, "Liberty consists of doing anything which does not harm others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has only those borders which assure other members of the society the enjoyment of those same rights. These borders can be determined only by the law." These were new ideas. But also, quote, "The law is the expression of the general will. All the citizens have the right of contributing personally or through their representatives to its formation," end quote. There was a general move toward individual rights and away from aristocracy. There was even a talk of a United States of the world, in which all the countries in the world would relate to one another sort of like the states of the new United States. When Edmund Burke wrote a conservative critique of the French Revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft responded by writing Vindication of the Rights of Men. The pamphlet attacked aristocracy and argued for a form of democracy in which people would receive reward not for the situation of their birth, but for their own merit and hard work. Its reception, the reception of what she wrote, was complicated. One biographer wrote, "The Rights of Men was successful. It was reviewed by every major periodical of the day, and the first edition, published anonymously, sold out in 3 weeks. However, upon the publication of the second edition, the first to carry Wollstonecraft's name on the title page, the reviews began to evaluate the text not only as a political pamphlet, but also as the work of a female writer. They contrasted Wollstonecraft's passion with Burke's reason and spoke condescendingly of the text and its female author. This analysis of the rights of men prevailed until the 1970s, when feminist scholars began to read Wollstonecraft's texts with more care and called attention to their intellectualism," end quote. She followed Rights of Man a few years later with a work she entitled Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In it, she mostly accepted men's criticism about women's weakness, but she believed the cause was an ignorance forced on women by a culture designed by men. In Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she wrote, "Why should women be kept in ignorance under the specious name of innocence? Men complain, and with reason, of the follies and caprices of our sex. Behold, I should answer, the natural effect of ignorance. Women are told from their infancy and taught by the example of their mothers that a little knowledge of human weakness, justly termed cunning, softness of temper, outward obedience, will obtain for them the protection of a man. And should they be beautiful, everything else is needless for at least 20 years of their lives." End quote. So, Contrary to many a man's opinion, it wasn't something inherent in the female condition, Wollstonecraft said, that made women less qualified to be authors or landowners. It was that men had created a society which forced women and the poor and children into roles of subservience. A biographer wrote, she thought that children and youth were subject to a slavish bond to parents, which, quote, cramps every faculty of the mind. Children, write that down. Not mine, but everybody else's. But, Mary Wollstonecraft argued, if boys and girls, if men and women were educated together with equal skill and equal content of instruction, women would rise to equality with men. The view of women as property of men would only be overcome when women and girls were given the same educational opportunities as men. Give women those opportunities, she argued, and they would thrive. In fact, in Rights of Woman, Mary argued more than 100 years before women were given the right to vote in our country, that all the rights in that pamphlet, the rights of men from the French Revolution, all those rights applied equally to women. Because, she said, a just and loving God would not create one gender to be subservient to the other. But Mary wasn't only an advocate for women's rights. She was opposed to a society that allowed access to wealth and power based on class, based on gender, or any of a number of other artificial divisions. As one biographer put it, her vision of a society was based on equality of opportunity, in which talent, not the wrongful privileges of gentility, would be the requisite for success. One way to ensure that equality that she talked about would be to have communities regulate their schools, rather than just allowing each school to decide what it would teach. Another idea which seems to be under threat these days. She also saw that for access to wealth to be equal, extravagant wealth and massive land ownership had to be broken up, since in her day large estates were owned by the wealthy class and were used to keep people who worked the land in subservience. Those large estates should be divided into smaller farms, she said, and more people from what we might call the developing middle class should be given access to ownership of those properties. She also opposed war and other forms of societal oppression. She said, let there be no coercion in established society. And the common law of gravity prevailing, the sexes will fall into their proper places, which was equal for her. She was a transcendentalist in the league of Margaret Fuller and Ralph Waldo Emerson, believing that people could rely on their own experience of the world, no priest necessary. From another biographer, quote, she sensed the presence of God in nature and recorded a mystical experience in which her, quote, these are Mary's words, her soul rested on itself and seemed to fill the universe. Like religious liberals of all ages, Wollstonecraft believed that, again in her words, true grace arises from some kind of independence of the mind. She once said to her publisher and friend, Joseph Johnson, I am determined. Your sex generally laugh at female determinations, but let me tell you, I never resolved to do anything of consequence that I did not adhere resolutely to it, till I had accomplished my purpose, improbable as it might have appeared to a more timid mind. End quote. She died, and this is humbling, at the age of 38, 11 days after giving birth to Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who went on to write Frankenstein under the name Mary Shelley. How, nearly 250 years later, can we still be fighting some of the same fights? This is a question I think a lot of people are asking themselves these days. And I'm coming to believe that the way we talk about social justice causes makes some of our frustration worse. Too often, we talk about it, I have talked about it, social justice, as a march toward a promised land, which we will someday reach. But reality doesn't seem to bear that out. What I observe is that we live our entire lives in one era or another, Our lives are longer than they used to be, but they're still exceedingly short. So we can't experience the progress made over the course of 200 or 300 years, and there's always more work to be done. So I say, instead of thinking of ourselves as marching to a promised land of justice and peace, let us begin to talk about faithfulness. Living lives of faithfulness to a cherished set of values. Then our job is to ask ourselves in every new situation, positive or negative or some of both, how will I now live out my values? How will I now be faithful? There are lights along the way, and Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the brightest. She reminds us that our work may come to fruition in the next generation. But like her, despite the setbacks, let us be faithful to the call of a greater love, a fuller justice than we know today. Amen.